Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for the National Conference of State Legislators webinar, Encouraging Efficiency, Policies to Promote Utility Energy Efficiency. My name is Glenn Anderson, the Energy Program Director at NCSL, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Our presenters will be discussing the benefits of energy efficiency and exploring a variety of innovative approaches that states are taking to reward utilities that utilize this abundant, low-cost energy resource. But before we begin, I wanted to mention that the webinar is being recorded and that all registrants will be able to access the recording of the webinar and presentation slides on the NCSL website. We will be sending out an email shortly after the webinar to notify you when the presentation and the slides are posted. I would also like to call your attention to the webinar resources that are available through the interface you're looking at right now. Above the presentation, you will see a couple of tabs. One of them is labeled Resources. Here you can find and download PDF version of the PowerPoint. There's another tab labeled Speaker, where you can read the bios of today's speakers as well. You can also access these tabs at any time during the presentation. I want to note that the presenters will also be answering questions after the final presentations, but we encourage you to enter your questions in at any time during the presentation. Please type them in the question box, which is in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, at any time during the webinar, and our presenters will be happy to follow up and discuss your questions at the end. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Annie Galeo. She manages ACEE's state-based technical assistance activities and conducts research on energy efficiency resource standards, utility business models, and other state-level policies. Annie was also lead author of the 2013-2015 editions of the State Energy Efficiency Scorecard. So Annie, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I'm just going to start off by letting folks know a little bit about ACEEE, or the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. We are a nonprofit, non-member organization founded in 1980, so coming up on our 40-year anniversary, that acts as a catalyst to advance energy efficiency policies, programs, technologies, investments, and behavior. And we do that in a variety of ways, but most particularly through in-depth research on a variety of energy efficiency areas and by providing technical assistance to state policymakers, state agency staff, and others interested in energy efficiency. So I want to do a little bit of level setting before we start diving into sort of the what of energy policy, and just focus in on what we are really talking about today so that we all understand what we mean when we say energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is the use of less energy to provide the same or better products, services, or amenities. So we're not talking about any particular generation source today. Instead, we're talking about how to use less energy but achieve the same or better outcomes. So some examples of energy efficiency might be behavioral changes that we can encourage through things like home energy reports or thermostats that automatically adjust the temperature, equipment and appliance replacements like switching out your HVAC for a more efficient unit or adjusting your building systems, and also kind of overall adjustments to buildings and processes, things like insulation in your buildings, in your homes and office buildings, or strategic energy management for large commercial buildings. So another phrase that you might hear is demand-side management, and I just wanted to frame how energy efficiency fits within demand-side management. It's a core piece of demand-side management, but DSM, or demand-side management, is something a little bit broader. We're talking about energy efficiency, which means essentially a constant reduction in demand so that you're lowering overall daily usage. It can also be something that we would call load shifting, demand response, or demand flexibility, where we can shift load across the hours of a day in the utility system and sort of reshape the way our load curve looks. And finally, another key element of DSM is distributed generation. So moving away from these large power plants to smaller sources of energy that are distributed across the grid. So all of those things contribute to demand-side management. And today we're going to focus in on energy efficiency, but a lot of the policies that we're talking about today, I think, reflect and are important for DSM as a whole. So I wanted to also take some time to just talk a little bit about how energy efficiency is impacting our economy and our energy usage as a whole. We have tracked the impact of energy efficiency over time and have found that it's really succeeding. In this chart, you can see that top dark gray line shows the estimated energy usage without efficiency and structural changes to the economy. That green bit are structural changes to the economy, so changing the way that Americans make a living. We're producing less widgets and investing more in our service economy, and that reflects that. But that big blue chunk is energy efficiency. And so were it not for those two things, we would be up at the gray line at the top of this chart. Instead, we find ourselves at this sort of flat orange line at the bottom of the chart. So my point here is I really want you to think of energy efficiency as an important resource. In fact, in the electricity sector, efficiency is now our third largest resource, behind natural gas and coal and in front of nuclear. That means that it is making up a huge part of the way that we meet the demand for energy in our country. With smart and proactive energy policies, it could become our largest resource by 2030. So efficiency is big. So what? It looks like we're missing some words on this slide somehow. So if you can't see them, I'm going to tell you. Efficiency decreases greenhouse gas emissions and other forms of pollution. It delivers household savings, right? We often talk about it as a way to control your energy bills. It brings a return on investment of 200% or more. So when utilities invest in energy efficiency, they're required to show that those investments are cost effective, meaning they will deliver more benefits to customers than costs. At the same time, it importantly reduces energy burdens for those most in need. So we have looked at the impacts of energy efficiency across a wide range of customers. We find that low-income households typically have outsized energy burdens, meaning that they are paying far more of their total household income toward energy as a proportion than households of other income levels. Energy efficiency can reduce those energy burdens by a quarter to a third, depending on the area where the customer lives. Energy efficiency also improves health, safety, and comfort. Doing things like insulating your homes and replacing windows not only saves energy, but also keeps the home more temperature controlled and comfortable. It's an important resilience technology, and it creates jobs and expands economic development. So efficiency jobs are local jobs. These are contractors and construction workers in your towns and communities, and efficiency jobs, in other words, are not jobs that you can outsource to another state. Efficiency also has a large role to play in reducing emissions. Here you can see that the pink area there is lower demand growth. So just reducing the overall growth in demand has played about half of the role in reducing emissions overall. I also wanted to put efficiency sort of into kind of a more policy context. This is a chart that NRDC came up with showing a pathway to getting emissions to zero over time. And a lot of the way that we think about reducing emissions is by replacing fossil fuel generation with renewable energy generation. That's that green bar on the grid. But you can see the blue bar there is energy efficiency. So it's a combination of energy efficiency, renewable energy, moving toward electrification, and decarbonizing our buildings and transportation that will really have the most major climate impact. Today we're going to talk about energy efficiency in the utility sector. So I want to encourage you to be thinking about energy efficiency as a resource that utilities can invest in, the same way they might invest in a power plant to meet customer demand. Importantly for our discussion, energy efficiency is a least cost resource. This is why it saves customers money. It's not just participants who are replacing appliances and equipment in their homes or businesses, but it's the customer base as a whole because the utility is investing in a lower cost resource, which has a ripple effect into overall rates and bills in the long term. Although it is a least cost resource, as we'll talk about, utilities may not have an incentive to invest in it in the way they would other resources. So we're going to talk about some policy fixes that will help get us to a place where utilities want to be investing in this beneficial resource. So let's dive in. What are the core policies that drive energy efficiency? ACEE every year takes a look at state policies across the country through a publication called the State Energy Efficiency Scorecard. I'm showing you the map here. You can see the rankings reflect how states are doing when it comes to energy efficiency policy progress. We look at efficiency across a whole range of sectors, everything from the utility sector to transportation to buildings and industry. But the utility sector is where we see the most opportunity for energy savings, and so that's where the bulk of our points are awarded in our scorecard. And that's where I want to focus our time today. I want to focus on just a few key policies. There are more than this. This is not what I would call a comprehensive list, but this is an impactful list. So today we're going to talk about things that state legislators can do to encourage utilities to invest in energy efficiency. They can set requirements and funding for energy efficiency programs led by utilities or a third party using ratepayer dollars. Legislators can develop energy efficiency resource standards, in other words, energy savings goals for utilities or other third parties, and they can make changes to the utility business model. We're going to talk about some of those, specifically performance incentives and either decoupling or some other way to unlink a utility's overall sales from its profit. Let's start with goals. So currently there are 26 states with electric efficiency targets in place, and this is a map showing the relative stringency of those targets. We have had a recent rollback in Ohio, but there have also been recent adoptions, most recently in New Jersey and New Hampshire. So it's been fairly steady state with about half of states implementing efficiency targets since 1999. Texas was actually the first state to adopt an energy efficiency resource standard. Now, I think you'll notice that these targets they vary a lot in terms of stringency, that the states that are adopting them are quite different. And so I want to talk about the various models that states are using to set targets. And I'm going to give 3 examples. So the first is a target setting model. This is where legislation is explicit about the level of energy savings that are expected from utilities within the legislative language. So, for example, Minnesota passed a piece of legislation that says that each individual utility and association shall have an annual energy savings goal equivalent to 1.5%. So, very clear level of energy savings set over time. This legislation also establishes a baseline and some details around how energy savings are measured. Other states have instead shifted responsibility to the State Utility Regulatory Commission. Pennsylvania is actually a hybrid approach that I've shown here. So this piece of legislation set targets for the first 5 years, starting at 1% energy savings, ramping up to a cumulative 3% savings, and then directed the commission to reassess goals at least every 5 years thereafter and establish cost-effective energy savings goals. And finally, another approach is an all-cost-effective model. There are several states in the Northeast, as well as California, who have taken this approach. Here, legislation requires that the Commission issue an order approving all energy efficiency measures that are cost-effective and lower cost than acquisition of additional supply. So the legislation is not prescriptive about what level of energy savings are deemed cost-effective, but rather requires the Commission to undertake some assessment or analysis to determine what that amount is and approve all cost-effective energy efficiency. So those are the models. I want to talk a little bit about results. Here I've shown a chart showing states without an energy efficiency resource standard compared to states with such a standard, and recent data showing overall energy savings. So in 2017, states with an EERS in effect achieved incremental energy savings of 1.2% compared to average savings of 0.3% in states without an EERS. So that's a fourfold increase in average savings in states with savings targets compared to those without. An EERS is by far the most impactful energy efficiency policy in the utility sector that we have seen to date. That said, EERS policies don't operate in a vacuum. I mentioned that utilities may not have the incentive to invest in energy efficiency without updates to the utility business model. And here I'm listing some of these barriers or roadblocks to the traditional utility business model. So program costs are a barrier. If utilities are not able to recover these costs, program administrators suffer financial losses. They also have something called the throughput incentive. So energy saved by programs doesn't reduce near-term fixed costs of service. So in other words, utilities have an incentive to sell more energy because that's how they make money. Efficiency also has a lack of return. So money spent on efficiency programs doesn't provide financial returns to investors. When a utility invests in a capital improvement, like building a new power plant, they do receive a return on equity. Without important adjustments to the utility business model, they don't get that same sort of incentive for efficiency. That said, there are mechanisms for overcoming these barriers. So first and foremost, almost every state already has cost recovery in place. So this is a simple rule that allows utilities to recover the costs associated with program delivery through a rate structure or a rider on a customer's bill. That addresses just kind of expenditures out, expenditures in. States have also chosen to address the throughput incentive, or the incentive to sell more energy, either through decoupling or something that we call a lost revenue adjustment mechanism. Decoupling essentially guarantees a utility its agreed upon revenue requirement, but no more or no less. So in other words, regardless of how much energy a utility sells, it will receive its revenue requirement. If sales are below expected because of energy efficiency or really any other reason, changes in weather, the utility will still receive its agreed upon rate revenue requirement. And the flip side is also true. So decoupling can result in small charges to customers, but it can also result in small returns to customers. And we see that decoupling usually has a bill impact of about plus or minus 1%. So the risk is quite low. We've also seen states offer utilities performance incentives, so providing an opportunity to earn on efficiency investments the same way that they would be able to earn on capital improvements. So this essentially puts efficiency on equal footing as any other capital investment a utility might make. And I wanted to show you a map of the states that have put these policies in place for electric utilities. So 29 states offer a performance incentive for at least one major electric utility within their state. 17 states have incentives for natural gas efficiency programs. And these, by and large, apply to utilities, but some states have chosen to implement efficiency programs through third-party administrators, and some states then do have performance incentives in place for their administrators. 31 states have addressed disincentives for investment in efficiency through electric utilities, either through decoupling or through lost revenue adjustment mechanisms, and it's about a half-and-half split. New Mexico is the most recent state to adopt a decoupling mechanism, and we're going to hear about that next, so I won't get into detail there. Natural gas utilities also are quite frequently decoupled. 7 states have implemented a lost revenue adjustment mechanism for natural gas utilities. 24 have a decoupling mechanism in place. Now, all this to say that a complete business model is really the most impactful way to drive energy savings. I talked about an EERS delivering average savings of about 1.2% for all the states with targets in place. There are 8 states with a complete business model in place. So that would be EERS, cost recovery, decoupling, and performance incentives. Savings in those states are average about 1.5%, which is higher than states with only a partial set of policies in place. So I guess all this to say that we really want to be sure we're getting utilities on board to make investments that make sense for the customer. It needs to not only make sense for the customer, but also make financial sense for the utility. So summing up, what are key things that legislators can do to promote efficiency? First and foremost, I want to encourage you to be thinking about an energy efficiency resource standard or a clean energy standard that includes explicit energy savings goals. It's certainly possible to implement, for example, a greenhouse gas goal that includes a specific sub-goal for electricity savings, and we've seen several states consider this approach recently. For example, in Massachusetts, the most recent kind of design for energy savings goals sets up an electric target, but also an overall broader BTU target that allows utilities to invest not only in electric savings, but in anything that will reduce emissions. I mentioned that targets can either be defined within legislation or can include a clear directive to the Utility Commission to establish targets. Utility business model is another key thing to deal with, and here I would encourage you to think comprehensively, either decoupling or a lost revenue adjustment mechanism with appropriate ratepayer protections to make sure that that risk is not borne inherently by customers or by the utility, but that you're setting up a system where everyone is a winner, and also a performance basis that allows a utility to consider investments in efficiency the same way that it would consider investments in a generation resource. And there are some additional supportive policies. I was trying not to get into the nitty-gritty today, but really focus on sort of the most big impact things. But there are other ways to ensure that energy efficiency investments are long-lived and that you're setting up a framework that will be impactful over time. So a couple of other things I would encourage are the establishment of a permanent working group to build consensus and understanding around energy efficiency programs and policies. There are several states that have such working groups in place, and that really is a great forum for discussion among stakeholders and streamlines the process for getting these programs up and running. And also align cost-effectiveness testing methodologies with state policy objectives. So I mentioned that one of the ways to set targets is to require utilities to implement all cost-effective energy efficiency. What we really want to be sure is that those rules for what all cost-effective means are aligned with state policy priorities. If reducing emissions is a state policy priority, is that in your cost-effectiveness test? If economic development is the policy priority, is that in your cost-effectiveness test? So that's another thing that states are increasingly looking at to ensure that they are investing in energy efficiency programs that make sense for their state. So I'll close there. I did want to point you toward a few ACEE conferences that are coming up throughout the rest of the year and into 2020, where we'll be diving into these topics and more. And my contact information, so please do feel free to follow up with questions or comments. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Annie, for that captivating presentation. There's a lot of information there, and I know this is a really deep and complex issue. Just so you know, as listeners, we, as NCSL, have published a number of documents that summarize and explore a number of these topics that Annie has also discussed as well. So in addition to the ACEE resources, we do encourage you to visit our website, ncsl.org, and to go to our energy page where we have explored a number of these topics as well. So one thing I want to remind you is please, if you do have questions, type them in the box. And we will be answering those after this next presentation. So our next speaker is Ken Hughes. He's a clean energy specialist at New Mexico's Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, where he manages the Sustainable Building Tax Credit Program, Solar for Low and Moderate Income Strategy, and the Energy Efficiency Working Group. From 1993 to 2007, he also headed the planning section of the Department of Finance and Administration. So let's welcome Ken.
Thank you. Hello, folks. That picture of me is not here in New Mexico. That's Tahiti, but I couldn't resist. I want to talk about what we're doing in New Mexico already and what we plan to do regarding energy efficiency, both the regulatory and financial side in the state. As was mentioned, I'm at the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resource Department, and we also have a Public Regulation Commission with a staff that oversees the utilities, but I'll be talking more broadly about what we're doing in New Mexico. The state government is really ramping up its initiatives and joining other states and really promoting performance contracting as an example. We've started recently with working with energy service companies to assess public building needs for ramping up efficiency, and already passed $200 million in projects among state agencies, public schools, universities, cities, and counties. Many of those start with one or two projects, and then it works out so well they want to go full tilt. For instance, Doñana County next to El Paso in Mexico did a couple buildings, and our engineer just came back and said they want to do them all. So they liked how this works for them so well. The state itself is putting new money into retrofitting all of these state buildings here in Santa Fe, and also putting in the renewable projects at many of these buildings, $32 million worth. I'm glad Annie suggested doing an energy efficiency working group. We've had ones here since 2010, over 55 meetings. Tomorrow we're going to visit a LEED Platinum apartment complex in Albuquerque to get out and seeing what really works. A lot of these meetings have also covered what utilities are doing to up their game on energy efficiency. And we're also going to create a new energy manager working group with the aim to get behavioral changes in place among the building and energy managers that the state has hired for folks. So we're not in the top tier of energy efficiency states as measured by ACEQ. We did jump 7 states in the last scorecard, so we're trying to get there. Another program we have in place since 2008 is called the Sustainable Building Tax Credit Program. And we've since then given over 9,000 tax credits to owners or builders of these buildings, mostly homes. And those who get a home energy score of 40% less than code get a tax credit. It's very popular. It's not only saves energy, it saves carbon. The average home cuts their carbon dioxide annual emissions by 4.5 tons a year, which is equivalent to somebody not driving, flying, eating meat, and having solar. So that's a heavy lift to do by an individual. But putting this in place as an incentive through tax credit, we find really works quite well. Now on to utility efficiency. This year we had a huge law passed into place called the Energy Transition Act, which puts Mexico on it was the third state to adopt a zero carbon standard this by 2045, a renewable portfolio standard of 80% by 2040. So that's gotten a lot of attention, and obviously we need to have efficiency play a major role in meeting the carbon neutral goal, and that'll be rolling out fairly soon. And utilities will have a major role in that as well. So that got a lot of attention. In the meantime, we did reauthorize the Efficient Use of Energy Act in this session as well. House Bill 291 passed and signed into law by Governor Grisham on April 3rd. And this expands on the original law that we've had in place since 2005, which directed investor-owned utilities to implement cost-effective energy efficiency programs for their customers. So this has resulted in lower rates for ratepayers, and the utilities have been able to avoid building new power generation facilities because they've upped their game on energy efficiency. The savings requirements in that act will have ended in 2020, which is why this new law was needed. So House Bill 291 does three important things. First, it sets new 10-year savings requirements. So the first 5 years are set laid out in the legislation, and the requirements for 2026 through 2030 will be set by our Public Regulation Commission. It also, we joined 17 other states in authorizing decoupling. So the law directs the Commission to adopt a rate adjustment mechanism to ensure that the revenue per customer approved in a utility's rate case is recovered by the utility without regard to the quantity of electricity sold, thus decoupling revenue and sales. So this removes the financial disincentive that utilities face when they implement successful energy efficiency programs for their customers. So this is a consumer-friendly mechanism that ensures utility revenue neither exceeds nor falls short of the amount authorized by the Commission, and it only applies if the utility requests it. So we're happy to have that in place. And finally, the new law allows utilities to spend between 3 and 5% of revenues on cost-effective energy efficiency and load management programs for their customers. The current funding is fixed at 3%, which constrains the programs for some utilities. The law retains a requirement from the previous bill that at least 5% of the energy efficiency program budget be targeted to the poor. So by increasing savings requirements out another decade, the bill continues to keep rates as low as possible by allowing utilities to avoid the construction or purchase of additional generation. I want to mention a case study here in San Felipe Pueblo, which is roughly equidistant between Albuquerque and Santa Fe along the Rio Grande. It's about 400 homes, about 300 are stick-built, the rest are manufactured. The gas company in New Mexico, which is our largest gas and investor-owned gas utility, approached the Pueblo and wanted to design a low-income weatherization program for the tribe. They hired a contractor who was going to go door to door to get people to sign up. Well, he was from El Paso, not from the tribe. So given a cultural reticence to open your doors to strangers and often the use of a traditional Tiwa language, the Native-speaking housing authority stepped up and went door to door to sign up folks to receive a comprehensive weatherization retrofit. And they were very successful and got hundreds of people signed up. So the result is that in the wintertime, the natural gas bills have been decreased by up to $70 a month, which for a lot of people is a huge savings. Thank you very much, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
All right, thank you for that excellent overview of all the activity in New Mexico, Ken. That was fantastic. And again, if there are any more questions, feel free to type them in the chat box there on the lower left. So now we do have some time for taking some questions, and we have had a number come in, so I will be asking those now. And the first question, I guess, could be really to either of you. Do you have any examples of what you would call model or very effective energy efficiency legislation that has created perhaps a really good program in a state that could be used as a model for other states? So other policymakers that may be looking to emulate legislation that has been effective in one state, which states might you suggest, or specific policies in those states that you think could be used as a model?
Sure. This is Annie. I think there are lots of good examples, and I'm happy to point you toward specific ones. I think one thing that I do want to make clear is that different policy models work well for different states. So, for example, Massachusetts passed its energy efficiency goals in the Green Communities Act, and that does a few things. One, it directs the Commission to approve all cost-effective energy efficiency programs, and it also establishes a framework whereby the state government is able to offer funding and assistance to communities who are engaging in energy efficiency efforts. So that really allows some kind of unique program opportunities that aren't available in other states. But it is contingent upon there being a good source of funding. So, for example, Massachusetts is part of the RGGI framework and is able to spend greenhouse gas emission revenues on that program in addition to ratepayer dollars. The decision between setting targets legislatively or kicking it toward the Commission to conduct an analysis, I think has a lot to do with where you are more likely to achieve strong goals. In some states that may be through the legislature, in other states it may be through the Commission, so that's something to weigh out as well. I would say that certainly I would want to kind of look at the context of the state asking the question before pointing them toward a great example. For example, in the Southeast, Arkansas has some of the strongest goals. Those have really been led, though, by the State Utility Commission, but certainly the level of targets could be adopted for neighboring states. In the Southwest, Arizona has very strong goals, although the kind of enforcement of those goals has varied based on the makeup of the Utility Commission.
Great. And Ken, did you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, just the bill we just passed, House Bill 291, about the efficient use of energy would be the one I'd point to, and I'd be glad to provide copies to anybody who would like it.
Great. And another question that just came in, does anyone know of a study that looks into demand reduction for energy around patterns of development? That is to say, I think it's relative to just focusing on individual buildings, but looking at kind of, I guess it could be neighborhoods.
I guess I'll point to a few things. If you're looking for something quantitative, I think NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, has done some work around land use planning and probably has some numbers. We also look at some land use planning policies as part of our state scorecard, things like complete streets policies, because those certainly have impacts for overall energy usage. So that is an important efficiency strategy.
I'd also point to the LEED folks, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. They have a whole standard called LEED for neighborhood development, and I'm sure they have some case studies or models that one could look at to be inspired by.
Great. And another question that we had is there's this discussion around, and as you may be aware, there's been rollbacks in a few states with the argument that they're saving money on rates since they do not have to pay for the energy efficiency program. I was wondering if you could explore or discuss the ways in which legislation or programs are evaluated with regards to how much savings they are getting for the amount of money invested relative to other investments, and I guess the difference between the rate that someone pays and their total bill, and how that you may have perhaps a higher rate with an efficiency program, but then your total bill may be lower because you're purchasing a lot less electricity because you're using it more efficiently.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So I'll say a few things. First is that in every state, energy efficiency programs, with a few exceptions, must show that they are cost effective in order to be approved by the Commission. So sometimes low-income programs are not held to that same standard, but by and large, every other program that a utility is bringing to a commission must be proven to be cost effective, or in other words, the benefits of that program must be more than the costs. Every dollar in will generate more than $1 in benefits for ratepayers. So the idea of saving customers money by rolling back programs is flawed, because that means that you are eliminating those benefits. And since we know that the benefits are greater than the costs, customers are losing something, certainly, when those programs are rolled back. I think it's also important to think about how efficiency fits into the utility system and how it benefits both participants and non-participants. And here it's important to think about, yes, rates versus bills. There may be short-term rate impacts as efficiency comes online. You're adding a cost because utilities are doing something new, and that can be a little scary. But participants certainly directly benefit. They are more able to control how and when they use energy because they're installing more efficient appliances. They are likely to see immediate changes in their bills where they're seeing savings that outweigh the cost of those programs for them. Non-participants, though, benefit too. I mentioned that energy efficiency is a lower cost resource than other generation sources, so it's important to think about sort of the long-term impacts. Eventually, a utility is going to have to decommission an old coal plant or an old nuclear plant, even if they have excess capacity now. Will they 20 years down the line? Efficiency is an important hedge against that. It's far less costly than investing in a new plant, whether you're long or short on capacity. It also has impacts for upgrades needed to transmission and distribution infrastructure. For example, utilities in New York have been able to delay and then ultimately cancel upgrades on distribution infrastructure because they've invested in targeted efficiency programs for the areas around that infrastructure. So I think there's some flawed logic behind thinking that you'll save customers money by rolling back efficiency programs, because you're not looking at the big picture of long-term investments that utilities are going to have to make.
Great. And I guess, Ken, could you comment perhaps on whether that discussion took place with regards to some of the policies in New Mexico and whether those added costs or how you, or whether there were other challenges to, or ways you built coalitions or understanding with utility with regards to implementing and getting this legislation passed?
I wasn't privy to all the meetings, but I do know that the major saliency was around the Energy Transition Act, and I think that helped because this one was able to get through without very much people. I don't think anybody was dead set against it at all. There might have been some concerns here and there, but it was pretty much met with near unanimous approval.
Great. And I guess with regards to some of these challenges and all the different kind of menu of options that a policymaker might have, what might be your thoughts on the first steps one might take in evaluating where they're at and what their next step might be? I think that talking about your discussion around the business model was very informative, and whether or not there's support by the utility might be directly connected to whether it has decoupling or some sort of other incentives. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about building support, and also what are the as I said, what are the first steps a policymaker might want to take in their state as they, if they are interested in increasing the efficiency policy efforts?
I'll offer a few thoughts. First, I think baselining is important. Have an understanding of what's in place and why, and there are definitely tools that ACEEE has that can help folks do that. We have a state scorecard, but we also have a utility scorecard that looks at sort of the overall structures that are in place around the utility system. So that's a nice way to kind of lay out where you are. I think it's important to identify your overall goals and then think about the structures that will get you there. So energy savings goals are one piece, but we often see states look at a comprehensive package of efficiency policies and try and move forward a larger piece of legislation. Other states have chosen to move sort of one piece of the puzzle at a time, doing maybe decoupling first and then incentives or targets. I think keeping in mind how they all fit together is important, and then kind of assessing what makes political sense in your state is a key next step. But probably most importantly would be to engage key stakeholders as early on in the process as possible. So certainly utilities are key stakeholders. There are likely efficiency or environmental advocates in your state who will have a lot of insight into kind of what makes sense in terms of efficiency legislation. Engaging a rate council or a consumer advocate is also going to be really important. And low-income groups, I know, for example, in New Mexico, they have specific requirements around low-income efficiency programs, and I think that's a really important way to make sure that the benefits of these programs are accruing to all groups, including those who might not be able to chip in to help defer some of those upfront costs.
I couldn't say it better. What Annie said was really on target. I did mention that case study of the natural gas company in New Mexico working with a tribe. They have found ways to work with low-income populations, including tribes and apartment dwellers, so that at least 30% of their portfolio could be construed as low-income programs. So it's very encouraging.
Great, and we have one final question here, and I think it's related to different opportunities for clean energy and whether energy efficiency is complemented or perhaps benefits or is hurt by net metering. We have a question basically asking, has anyone looked into how net metering may help or hurt energy efficiency? And I think you could also maybe discuss, folks that are interested in policies for clean energy, what combination of steps might be helpful as they select different resources.
Sure. We typically see discussions of net metering happening outside of the efficiency space and not closely linked to the policies that we covered here. So I don't want to dive too deeply into that, except to say that there are lots of opportunities for distributed generation and renewable resources to complement energy efficiency efforts, and thinking about how they all link together is really important, especially if you are trying to push for dramatic emissions reductions, for example, because all of those pieces are going to be important. So I mentioned earlier that some states are setting clean electricity or renewable energy goals. Thinking about a standalone efficiency target to complement that is a really effective way to make sure that you are both saving energy and therefore reducing your overall obligation to add new generation to the grid.
Yeah, net metering is one that really comes up with solar more than efficiency, at least in New Mexico. However, we're looking at helping support a pilot project in Las Cruces, our second largest city, that would combine white roofs with heat pumps for mini splits, and a pole-mounted solar array that we've devised in our office. Those three technologies together can help provide a cool room, as it's called, in Las Cruces, where over 100 degrees is very much more common these days and can literally be a life or death situation. So help getting a net metering, help offset some of the cost because we're adding solar to this mix, can help the economics improve over what it otherwise would be.
Well, great. Well, thank you both so much. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us and our audience. And we also want to thank our attendees for participating in today's webinar. And as a reminder, we will have a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides posted on our website within 5 days. And we will send out an email notifying you of that. Also, I wanted to let you know that on September 18th, we will be having a webinar at 2 p.m. Eastern that will focus on non-wires alternatives, which utilizes basically both energy efficiency, distributed generation, and energy management technologies to avoid costly infrastructure upgrades and also to lower the potential for stranded costs. And I think Annie talked a little bit about that, but we'll be exploring how states are implementing those policies into their resource plans and other policies as well. So I think that'll be a really interesting webinar. But again, let's give another thanks to our speakers, and we hope to have you on our next webinar. Thanks.